This is Ryan with QuietKat. Welcome back to our video series on maintenance. Today we're going to talk about how to replace the worn out cogs on the rear cassette. The tools you will need for this job are a 15mm open-ended wrench or socket, a large spanner, the chain whip, a cassette Lockring tool, and of course your replacement cogs. First thing we need to do is remove the rear wheel. In order to do that, we want to shift down into the smallest gear, which is the hardest gear on the bike. So we'll go ahead and rotate the pedals, shift down until we have the chain in the hardest gear. So we're going to loosen the two 15mm nuts on either side of the axle. You can do this with an open-ended wrench or a socket. Just get in here and loosen these up. Once the rear wheel is dropped out of the dropout, you're going to go ahead and pull the derailleur back. That way the wheel can pull out nice and easily and clear the chain. So now that we have the wheel off the bike, we're going to go ahead and move on to removing the cassette from the bike. So take the 15mm axle nut, remove that from the axle on the cassette side. Set that aside. There's also a washer here. I'm going to set that aside. Now we're going to use our chain whip. This can be kind of a confusing tool to use. The long tail, we're going to wrap around what I call the back side, and that's going to wrap around gear number 3. You know you have the chain whip on properly when the front portion is locked in, preventing the chain ring from spinning. Using our cassette Lockring tool, we're going to place that into the cassette Lockring, and then using our large spanner, we're going to go ahead and turn the cassette Lockring tool to loosen it up. With the chain whip at the 2 o'clock position, bringing your wrench into the 10 o'clock position, we're going to push both down, and that's going to loosen the cassette. Then use our fingers, pull the lock ring off, and then we can go ahead and pull off the bottom 2 cogs, discard those, and reinstall the new ones. You'll notice on the hub that there are splines that control how the cassette rings or cogs actually install onto the free hub body. So what we want to do is look for the skinny spline and align that on top. So then we'll take our larger ring. We're going to line up the small slot for the spline with the smaller spline on the free hub body and slide that into place. You'll notice it can only go in with the splines lined up properly, so you cannot install it wrong. Next we take our smallest ring, same idea, line up the spline. So once we've got our cogs in place, we'll go ahead and reinstall our lock ring. This just threads into the end. Start it by hand. Use our Lockring tool to go ahead and tighten it all the way up. You do not need the chain whip to tighten it. As you start tightening it, you'll start hearing some clicking. Now this is rated for 40 Newton meters. What that means is get it pretty snug, but don't go cranking on it to the point where you might break it. Then we'll go ahead and put our washer and axle nut back on. And you just want to thread this nut about halfway across the axle to make it easier to reinstall the rear wheel. Okay, put the rear wheel back on. It can be a little awkward as we have to lift it up into the dropout and get through the chain. So the first thing we're going to do is bring the wheel in from behind until the chain touches the cassette. At this point, we're going to take this bottom part of the chain, loop it around so that it's underneath the cassette. Rolling the wheel up slightly, pulling the derailleur back as we did to remove the wheel. We're going to line up the chain with the smallest cog in the cassette. We're going to roll the chain up and on as we lift the wheel up. Now we've gotten beyond the chain. Next thing we're going to look at is our alignment of the brake rotor. The rotor needs to align to slide up into the caliper nice and easily. Once we have the brake rotor aligned, go ahead and push everything up into place. Hold the wheel up in place and hand tighten the bolts. We just want these tight enough so that the wheel cannot fall out. We're going to drop the bike onto the ground, let gravity help us make sure the wheel is centered to fully tighten the bolts. So now that we have the bike on the ground, we can fully reinstall the rear wheel. What we want to do is use the weight of the bike to make sure that the wheel is centered and straight in the dropout. We're going to loosen both bolts, wiggle the bike, make sure it's straight, and then finally tighten them down. So the first thing we'll do is loosen each nut just ever so slightly so we know that the wheel can wiggle. Pressing down square from the top, make sure that the wheel is completely in, and go ahead and tighten the bolts. When tightening the axle nuts, you want to make sure that they're tight enough to maintain the wheel, but not super tight so that you don't break anything. Watch the wheel as you tighten each side to make sure that it's not moving up or down, left or right. And that's it. You're all ready to ride. Make sure before each ride, check to make sure everything's tight. Have a great time.